Welcome to In Real Life Wellbeing for Women. I'm your host, and this is your space for science-based strategies, coaching tools, and thoughtful conversations created for real women living real lives. Your well-being deserves attention, not when you reach crisis point, but now. So take this moment, not for your to-do list, but for you. At the start of a new year, many of us set intentions for how we want to feel, live, or care for ourselves differently. Those intentions are often thoughtful and purposeful. And yet, as the weeks and months go on, the habits we hoped would support those intentions can start to feel harder to maintain. This episode isn't about motivation, discipline, or starting again. It's about understanding why so many habit plans struggle once we get into the context of real life experience, and what the science actually tells us about sustaining change in everyday conditions. We'll explore how habits can be designed to integrate into real life rather than compete with it, and how small, flexible adjustments can support well-being over time without pressure or perfection. So let's start with the why and the science behind habit behavior. And so when we set those new intentions, we think about what we want to change, what we want to improve, or what we want to give more space in our lives to. These intentions are often thoughtful and purposeful. They're shaped by care for our health, our well-being, our energy, or the way we want to feel as the year unfolds. We don't usually lack motivation at this point. There is genuine intention there. We often make plans that we hope will work because we care about the outcome and because we want to support ourselves better. What tends to happen isn't that we stop wanting those things. It's that the plans we've made are revealed to be ideal plans. Plans that don't sit very comfortably in the context of living real life. And this is where I want to be very clear about the role of science, because I care deeply about evidence and the scientific method. Research in psychology, health, and behaviour change is incredibly valuable. Controlled studies allow us to see patterns, to help us understand relationships between behaviour and outcomes. They are repeated, reliable, and valid within the conditions they are designed for. That's why we can trust the findings. The challenge isn't the research itself, it's how those findings are often translated into everyday well-being advice. For research to establish clear patterns, it has to take place under controlled conditions. That means removing as many influencing variables as possible. In health and well-being research, that often means simplifying context, standardizing routines, and assuming a high level of personal agency over time, energy, and environment. Historically, it has also meant that women's lived realities are not always well represented. We know that women's physiology changes across the month. We also know that emotional load fluctuates. So does the changes with regard to responsibilities. And those responsibilities are shared unevenly within relationships. So research itself often acknowledges these limitations and then controls for those experiences that women have by either removing them from studies or selecting women during certain points of their cycle, for example. When these findings are translated into habit advice, they assume that daily life is predictable, that time is available, energy is consistent, and interruptions are minimal. They often assume that internal states, whether physical, hormonal, or emotional, remain relatively stable. They also assume that external demands from work, family, and other commitments can be organized around personal plans. But for many women, this isn't how life works. Competing responsibilities don't just take time, they carry an emotional weight. They are expectations to meet, people relying on us, and situations where there is no one else who can step in. When something unexpected arises, a work demand, a child's need, a shift in physical, emotional capacity, those well-considered intentions have to move aside. Not because we've chosen to abandon them, but because something else requires attention. So when plans stop working, it isn't because intention has disappeared or because discipline was lacking. It's because the plan itself was never designed to hold in that context. More recent research on habit advice has begun to focus on this exact gap. Instead of asking only how habits form, it asks how behavior continues in real-world conditions, where interruption is common and routines are rarely fixed. This body of work shows that habit strength is shaped not just by repetition, but by context, description, and how easily a behavior can restart after it has been interrupted. And that leads to a crucial reframe. Consistency doesn't mean doing the same thing in the same way every time. It means keeping a behavior present as life changes. For women living with competing responsibilities and ongoing uncertainty, flexibility isn't a lack of commitment. It's what allows a habit to remain possible over time. And let's now look at a practical starting point. So rather than thinking about habits as something you can either keep or abandon, it can be more helpful to think in terms of integration. Integration asks a different question. Not can I do this perfectly, but can this behavior stay present in my life as it actually is? There are a few core principles behind this way of thinking. The first is prioritization. Trying to integrate several habits at once increases mental load and reduces repetition. Research on behavior maintenance consistently shows that frequency matters more than intensity, particularly in the early stages. So instead of asking what you want to improve overall, it can help to identify one behavior that genuinely matters right now. Not in an abstract sense, but in a context of your life that you're living. And the second principle is scaling. Habits are more likely to last when they have a minimum viable form, a version that still counts on demanding days. This isn't about lowering standards or letting go of what matters. It's about adjusting execution so the behavior remains accessible when time, energy, or emotional capacity are limited. Consistent, modest engagement supports habit strength more reliably than occasional bursts of effort. The third principle is anchoring, and this is where it's helpful to add some nuance. In the habit literature, anchoring usually means linking a new behavior to something that already happens, a routine, a time, or an existing action. That can be useful, but in real life, relying on a single fixed cue often isn't enough. In practice, habits tend to hold better when they're supported by several familiar entry points rather than one rigid trigger. And those entry points don't always have to be specific behaviors. Sometimes they're moments of availability rather than activity. For example, a meeting being cancelled, a task taking less time than expected, someone else stepping in, freeing up capacity. So rather than saying, I do this behavior every day, so I'll do this new habit at that particular time, we can say, when something is missing, something changes, that's my opportunity to use that time wisely for something I'm really passionate about. It could even be noticing something you don't like doing. For example, mindlessly scrolling could be your trigger to say, right, put down the phone, do the habit that I really want to be doing right now. In those moments, the cue isn't what is happening, but what is no longer happening. The absence creates that space. This isn't a formal habit rule. It's an applied way of working with real life. It allows habits to begin wherever capacity appears, rather than only when a very specific condition is met. Finally, there's friction. Friction refers to anything that increases effort. Small reductions in friction can have a disproportionate impact on how often a behavior is repeated. And that might involve preparation, having what you need ready in advance so the behavior can happen when opportunity arises. But it also involves reducing decision load. When you have to repeatedly decide, do I do this thing now or do I do something else? The behavior is easier to postpone But when the decision is made already, when this situation occurs, this is what I do, the habit becomes easier to start. So, taken together, this approach shifts the focus away from willpower and towards design. So, take a moment to consider a habit you're trying to sustain. Not to consider how to change it immediately, but simply to notice where it assumes ideal conditions and where a small adjustment could support more reliable continuation. And so, the way I like to consider improving well-being is understanding the science and then having some tangible tools to take action. But most importantly, how to move forward and to sustain this. So let's bring this all together into real life context. So one of the most important insights from habit research is this: disruption isn't the problem. What matters is what happens next. Habits build through compounded behaviors repeated over time, not uninterrupted performance. That means the speed at which you return to the behavior after interruption plays a meaningful role in whether it lasts. This is where self-compassion becomes central, not as a mindset add-on, but as part of the system that supports continuation. Research on behavior lapses shows that self-critical responses increase cognitive load. When disruption is interpreted as personal inadequacy, attention shifts away from problem solving and towards self-evaluation. That shift makes restarting harder. Self-compassion works differently. It supports emotion regulation, protects self-efficacy, and shortens the gap between interruption and resuming that task. Importantly, the evidence does not show that self-compassion lowers standards or reduces effort. Instead, it supports persistence by preventing one disrupted moment from turning into complete disengagement. In practical terms, sustaining habit change looks less like rigid tracking and more like regular reflection. It involves making small adjustments as life shifts, rather than trying to hold a plan in place when that plan no longer fits the reality of everyday life. It also means recognizing that habits will look different across seasons. What works at one point in a year may need to change later. Reliability matters more than intensity, and continuation matters more than precision. This isn't about doing more. It's about choosing what matters and designing around it with enough flexibility to keep going, whatever is happening physically for you, socially, or as work, responsibilities, and life demands shift around you. As we come to the end of this episode, I want to leave you with this. If something you intended to do for your well-being hasn't held in the way you hoped, that isn't a personal failing. It's often a sign that the plan didn't account for the reality of your life, the demands, the changes, the interruptions, and the seasons you're moving through. Sustaining change isn't about doing more or holding yourself to a rigid standard. It's about noticing what matters, allowing habits to adapt, and returning to them with curiosity and self-compassion when life shifts. Well-being doesn't happen in controlled conditions. It happens in real life alongside work, relationships, responsibilities, and fluctuating energy. And habits that are designed with that reality in mind are far more likely to stay with you over time. Take from this episode whatever feels useful right now and leave the rest. You don't need to overhaul everything. Even small, considered adjustments can make change feel more possible. Thank you for joining me in Real Life Wellbeing for Women. If today's episode offered something useful or supportive, share it with somebody who'd appreciate it, and explore more insights in the Women's Wellbeing Lab. This isn't about doing more, it's about reducing overwhelm, feeling connected to what's important to you in this moment, and feeling well supported. Because well-being isn't a luxury, it's the foundations of health and happiness in real life.